toyed with Tommy Burt.
So we wouldn't see a black man beating a white man.
Yes.
I mean, it brings up just how difficult his life must have been, Burt, that this is, well, he's chasing Tommy Burns around more than 40 years before Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier in baseball, at which we know what Jackie Robinson had to go through. 40 years before, this is in the days of lynchings in this country, he's trying to become the biggest and as we then would call it, the baddest man on the planet. How difficult must his life have been?
It wasn't just his life, it's what he represented. Because the minute he won that title, he really unwelled a tremendous backlog of hate. This was the white man's crown. The white man's slave had become his master. It was the worst thing to happen to the white race since Tamerlane in the 14th century and his hordes had overrun Europe. And everybody hated him for it. Everybody. I mean, the establishment.
Right, the white establishment.
Which was the establishment,
right.
I mean, to be honest.
Of course.
And even as he continued to act his act, and Jack Johnson cared nothing for anything, he opened up a club in Chicago, the Café de Champion, which served all liquor and no morals. And even Booker T. Washington came out against him, the leader and the head, really, of the black voice of the time, because it was an era, real quickly, of reform. They were banning drinking, and it gained enough credence to become what? Prohibition. Mm-hmm. They banned betting on horses at tracks. Women couldn't drive bicycles if their ankles showed. And it was just a reform era, and here's a black man who is the strongest man in the world. He represents boxing, which at that time, the heavyweight champion was the premier athlete. And who is it? A black man. Jack Johnson had really unwelled a tremendous hatred, and he didn't care. He really didn't.
Tell us about Jim Jeffries now, called back out. Now, this is 5 years after. He's retired. He retired undefeated, right?
He retired in 1905, Jim Jeffries. He had beaten Bob Fitzsimmons, who had beaten Jim Corbett, who had beaten John L. Sullivan. Lineal champion. And some people, because he was not beaten, thought he was still the champion. It was a problem of succession.
Right.
I mean, they didn't know what to do hypothetically with John Tyler when he succeeded William Henry Harrison. Was he vice president or acting president? You know, what is he when Harrison dies? So they don't know what Johnson is, but Jeffries is. Johnson is not the champion. Jeffries is still the champion. So there is a move afoot which started in Sydney, Australia by Jack London, the great writer. Jeff, come off your farm and wipe this smile off this black man's face. Except he didn't say black man. Mm-hmm. And it's a white hope era. And they're going to try to get Jack Johnson. Now, Johnson, between Tommy Burns, where he's talking to Tommy, hit me, Tommy, hit me here. Nothing. Now faces Stanley Ketchel, middleweight champion, in a fight basically that's for film rights. It's a done deal.
There was an understanding between those two. Ketchel, yeah, we're going to put on a little show, we're going to make a little money.
And
right.
We'll go to a non-decision, and that's it. Except Ketchel gets a little frisky. And in the 10th round lands a right hand from hell, knocking Johnson down. Well, Johnson gets up. Count of 4.
And says, okay.
And as Ketchel runs in,
play that way. Yeah.
Ketchel runs in first punch, not only lays him out in a quasi-crucifixion scene, but the next thing you see is the referee's counting him out. Johnson is picking the teeth of Ketchel out of his glove. They want Johnson badly, and Jim Jeffries is their vehicle.
When we come back, we're going to talk about Jess Willard and talk about, of course, you know, in all the a lot of controversies through the years, Burt. And of course, controversy in this fight as well. Was it a fixed fight? Was it a bad style matchup? We'll talk about the all-time greats. Also talk about, you know, should Jack Johnson be a little higher on the list? Some people think so. We're going to take a break. We're back at Gleason's Gym and more as Jack Johnson faces Jess Willard here on our Top 10 Heavyweights. Back here at Gleason's Gym, ringside, the top 10 heavyweights. Jack Johnson at number 4 on Burt Randolph Sugar's list. As we talk now about one of the first fights of the century. There were a few, Burt, right? This is one of the first. And this was, of course, had social ramifications as well, as the ex-champ comes back to face Jack Johnson. How did this fight go actually in the ring with James Jeffries?
Real quickly, the fight was originally scheduled for California. The reform movement threw it out, but there was a rumor at that time that Johnson would let Jim Jeffries win. But when it went over to Reno, Nevada, the promoter, Tex Rickard, finding Reno as the cross switch for every railroad coming through the West, all bets were off. And yet it was an ugly scene reflecting the attitude of the day, the social attitude. As Johnson came in the ring, they played All Coons Look Alike to me. It was a totally white crowd. Jeffries was a 10-7 betting favorite.
Even though he'd been gone 5 years.
Well, it was all white money. And as such, the crowd was for Jim Jeffries. The atmosphere was for Jim Jeffries. And in the words of Jack Johnson, made no never mind. From get-go, he outpointed him, he outslugged him, he outmuscled him, he talked to him. Interesting sidelight, one of the handlers of Jim Jeffries in his corner was a man he had defeated twice, James J. Corbett. And he was making comments about Johnson being yellow, as all members of the race are, or something a little bit saltier. And Johnson would hit Jeffries, hold him, and talk to Corbett, saying, "You're next, Mr. Jim." 15th round, knocked him down 3 times. A poor Jeffries, nose broken, ribs broken, and his corner, Corbett and all of them, jumped in to save Jeffries, and the fight was over. But it had ramifications. There were riots in cities with whites killing blacks, 19 dead. Congress jumped in, forbade the interstate commerce of movies showing this fight. All boxing movies from here on in until the 30s were illegal. And last but not least, Jack Johnson looked unbeatable. So the government, deciding we can't get him in the ring, went after him to get him legally.
Explain the Mann Act then, exactly how he was put in that position.
The Mann Act was really a white slavery act. You cannot take women across state lines for immoral purposes. And yet they applied it to Jack Johnson, who took a woman across state lines. It just so happened he married her, Ann Cameron. They still got him. They got perjured testimony. They convicted him, sentenced him to $10,000 fine, a year and a day. He jumped bail. He went with a touring baseball company, Pop Foster or Rube Foster's baseball team, out of his Chicago house, across to Canada with his wife, over to Europe, and he basically was an expatriate from 1912 to 1919, fighting and living in 1915, I take it back, 1915, living in Europe, basically trying anything, bull fiddle acts, vaudeville, Shakespeare, fighting twice, and then comes an offer. Come to Havana and fight the winner of the Great White Hope contests. This ex-rodeo rider, he's so tall, 6'6", looks like the man that Jack met at the top of the beanstalk, named Jess Willard. And he's promised by the 2 promoters, Jack Curley and Harry Frazier, who later owns the Boston Red Sox, that they'll get him off the Mann Act. He won't have to serve.